The rain in northern Germany does not just fall, it seeps. In March 1946, in the small, forgotten village of Gottrupel, the rain was a cold, relentless weight pressing down on a nondescript farmhouse. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and old sweat. A man sat in a wooden chair, his body tense, his eyes darting between the shadows. He called himself Franz Lang. He spoke the rough, simple dialect of a farmhand. He claimed his life was one of cattle and dirt. But Captain Hans Alexander, a German-born Jew who had fled the Nazis only to return in the uniform of a British officer, knew the man in front of him was no farmer. He knew the stench of death did not wash off with soap. For hours the denial held. The prisoner was stoic, a wall of rural indifference. But then Alexander noticed the glint, a gold band on the man's finger. The prisoner claimed it was stuck, rusted to his skin by years of manual labor. Alexander didn't argue. He drew a combat knife, the steel catching the dim light of the lantern. He leaned in, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "Give me the ring," he said, "or I will cut off your finger." In the suffocating silence that followed, the mask of the farmhand finally fractured. The ring was pried loose. Inside the band, the engraving was unmistakable. Rudolf and Hedwig. The greatest manhunt in history had ended. The architect of Auschwitz had been unmasked. I'm warning you now. The story of what followed? The 22 days of silence, the cold, clinical confessions, and the descent into the mind of a man who treated genocide as a logistics problem will challenge your understanding of human evil. This is not a tale of a raving monster. This is the story of a bureaucrat, a family man, a man who watched 2.5 million people vanish into smoke, and then went home to read bedtime stories to his children. Before we uncover the visceral details of the interrogation that broke the butcher, make sure you are subscribed to Unethical. We are about to pull back the curtain on the capture of Rudolf Höss, the psychological warfare waged by a Jewish interrogator, the secret cyanide pill that never reached its mark, and the moment a man who oversaw the apocalypse finally realized he was a coward. This is the truth of the man who perfected the abyss. March 11th, 1946. The world was still reeling, picking through the ash of the Third Reich. While the high-ranking names like Göring and Hess were already sitting in the docks at Nuremberg, the most vital piece of the puzzle was missing. Rudolf Höss had vanished. To the Allied High Command, finding Höss was not just about retribution. It was about documentation. They needed the man who held the blueprints for the industrialization of death. But Höss had learned to be invisible. He had traded his SS insignia for the rough clothes of a sailor. He had assumed the identity of Franz Lang. He had moved to the countryside, blending into the millions of displaced persons and refugees clogging the roads of a broken Germany. For months, he worked as a farmhand, milking cows, tending horses, living a life of quiet, rural anonymity. He believed he had escaped. He believed the world would eventually stop looking. He was wrong. Captain Hans Alexander was not going to stop. Alexander was a man fueled by a unique, cold clarity. He had been born into a wealthy Jewish family in Berlin. He had seen the windows of his world shattered on Kristallnacht. He had fled to Britain, joined the army, and fought his way back across Europe with one goal: to bring the architects of his people's destruction to heel. When he was assigned to the 92nd Field Security Section, he was given a list of names. Rudolf Höss was at the top. The hunt led Alexander to a small cottage where Höss's wife, Hedwig, was hiding with her children. Alexander didn't use the blunt force of the Gestapo. He used the psychological pressure of the future. He told Hedwig that the war was over, but her son's life was not. He told her that if she did not give up her husband's location, her children would be handed over to the Soviet Union. He let the silence of that threat fill the room. He let her hear the sound of a train idling outside, telling her it was the transport to the east. Hedwig Höss, the woman who had lived in a villa overlooking the crematoria of Auschwitz, finally broke. She scribbled a name and a place on a scrap of paper. Gottrupel. When Alexander and his team arrived at the farm, they found a man who looked pathetically ordinary. There was no grandeur in his capture, no final stand. He was dragged from a woodshed, smelling of manure and fear. Even as they threw him into the back of a truck, he maintained the lie. "I am Franz Lang," he repeated. "You have the wrong man." But the British had more than just a name. They had the evidence of the gold ring. They had the signature that matched the Auschwitz ledgers. And they had the visceral hatred of men who had seen the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. During the initial transport, the soldiers did not treat him as a prisoner of war. They treated him as a monster. He was beaten, his face swollen, his ribs cracked. They wanted to kill him then and there in the mud of the German countryside. But Alexander stopped them. He knew that a dead Höss was a secret kept forever. A living Höss was a confession that would echo through history. To understand the man sitting in that British cell, one must understand how a human being becomes a machine. Rudolf Höss was not born a killer. He was born in 1901 in Baden-Baden, raised in a home defined by a suffocating, rigid Catholicism. His father, a former officer, intended for Rudolf to be a priest. The boy was taught that obedience was the highest virtue, that the word of a superior was the word of God. When the First World War broke out, a 15-year-old Höss ran away to join the army. He fought in the Ottoman Empire. He saw the brutality of the front lines before he had even learned to shave. He became the youngest non-commissioned officer in the German army, decorated for bravery, hardened by the sight of mass death. When the war ended, the priest in training was gone. In his place was a man who felt at home only in the ranks, a man who needed a master to follow. In the ruins of post-war Germany, the man who would become the architect of industrial murder found himself adrift. The Germany he returned to after the First World War was a fractured, starving husk, a place where the old codes of honor had been trampled in the mud of defeat. For Rudolf Höss, the transition to civilian life was impossible. He was a man who required a uniform to know who he was, and a command to know what to do. He joined the Freikorps, the paramilitary bands of embittered veterans who waged a shadow war against communists and perceived traitors in the streets. It was here, in the lawless atmosphere of the early 1920s, that Höss committed his first state-sanctioned murder. In 1923, he and several accomplices, including a young Martin Bormann, kidnapped and brutally beat a schoolteacher named Walter Haida, whom they suspected of betraying a Nazi hero to the French. They didn't just kill him, they executed him with a primitive, feral cruelty. Höss was caught and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Prison did not break Rudolf Höss. It perfected him. In the silence of his cell, he practiced a terrifying level of self-discipline. He learned to suppress every emotion, to endure isolation without a flinch, and to find comfort in the rigid schedule of the penitentiary. He would later write that this period was essential to his training. It was here he learned that a man could survive anything if he simply turned himself into a stone. When he was released in 1928 as part of a general amnesty, he joined the Ardeman League, a back-to-the-land movement that combined agricultural labor with a burgeoning Völkisch nationalism. It was there he met Heinrich Himmler. Himmler, a man who shared Höss's obsession with order and racial purity, saw in the quiet, stoic ex-convict the perfect instrument for his new elite guard, the SS. Himmler didn't want thinkers or rebels. He wanted executors. In 1934, Höss was sent to Dachau, the first of the Third Reich's concentration camps. Under the tutelage of Theodor Eicke, the man who developed the Dachau School of Camp Management, Höss was taught that the enemies of the state were not human. They were vermin. Pity was a sign of racial weakness. Höss watched as Eicke implemented a system of calculated dehumanization, and he took notes. He rose through the ranks at Sachsenhausen, and in May 1940 he was given his own command, a former Polish army barracks in a desolate, swampy stretch of occupied Poland, a place the Germans renamed Auschwitz. When Höss first arrived at Auschwitz, it was not the factory of death it would eventually become. It was a dumping ground for Polish political prisoners and Soviet POWs. It was a place of brutal labor and starvation, yes, but the mass industrial gassings were still a dark dream in Berlin's offices. Höss, ever the diligent manager, set to work expanding the facilities. He moved his wife, Hedwig, and their children into a 2-story villa just outside the camp's perimeter. He wanted a paradise for his family, even if that paradise was built on the edge of a charnel house. While he sat in his office, signing requisitions for coal and barbed wire, his children played on a wooden swing set just yards away from the high-voltage fences. The turning point, the moment Rudolf Höss entered the annals of ultimate depravity, came in the summer of 1941. He was summoned to Berlin for a private meeting with Himmler. The Reichsfuhrer SS didn't waste time with formalities. He told Höss that the Fuhrer had ordered the final solution of the Jewish question, and that Auschwitz had been chosen for the primary task of extermination. Himmler was clear. This was a secret mission of the highest importance. It would be difficult, unpleasant work, but it had to be done. Höss didn't blink. He didn't ask about the morality of murdering millions. He didn't ask about the logistics of disposing of a nation. He simply clicked his heels and accepted the order. He returned to Auschwitz with a problem to solve. The existing methods of mass killing, shooting victims into pits in the east, were, in his view, inefficient. They were loud. They were public. And they were psychologically damaging to the SS men pulling the triggers. Höss wanted something more clinical, something more humanitarian for the executioners. He began to experiment. He looked at the euthanasia centers in Germany where carbon monoxide had been used to kill the disabled, but he found the delivery systems too cumbersome. Then, his deputy, Karl Fritsch, made a discovery. They had been using a pesticide called Zyklon B to fumigate the barracks and kill the lice that brought typhus. Fritsch tried it on a group of Soviet POWs in the basement of Block 11. Höss watched through the peephole as the blue-tinted crystals were dropped into the room. He watched as the men inside struggled for air, their lungs seizing as the cyanide gas filled the space. In his later confessions to Hans Alexander, Höss admitted that seeing the success of this experiment made him feel calm. Not because he enjoyed the death, but because the technical problem of his mission had been solved. He had found his tool. Now he just needed the infrastructure. Over the next 2 years, under Höss's meticulous supervision, Auschwitz-Birkenau was transformed into the largest killing center the world had ever seen. He oversaw the construction of 4 massive crematoria, each equipped with underground undressing rooms and gas chambers disguised as showers. He coordinated with the German railway system to ensure that transport trains from every corner of Europe, from the canals of Amsterdam to the mountains of Greece, arrived with the regularity of a clock. He treated the genocide as a logistics project. He studied the flow of the victims. He optimized the burning capacity of the ovens. He was a man who saw no contradiction in worrying about the quality of the gravel on his garden path, while simultaneously calculating how many bodies could be crammed into a chamber to maximize the concentration of gas. By 1943, Höss had become the most successful mass murderer in history. He had perfected the art of the selection ramp, where SS doctors like Joseph Mengele would decide the fate of thousands in a matter of seconds. He had turned the death of millions into a bureaucratic routine. But even a man as cold as Höss was not immune to the pressures of the abyss. He began to drink heavily. He spent more and more time in his stables with his horses, the only creatures he felt he could truly trust. He was promoted to Berlin in 1943 to oversee the entire camp system, but his heart remained at Auschwitz. In 1944, when the order came to deport the 4 Ausreisner Jews of Hungary, Himmler knew there was only one man who could handle the volume. He sent Höss back. Operation Höss, they called it. It was his masterpiece. In less than 8 weeks, he oversaw the murder of nearly 500,000 people. The crematoria couldn't keep up. The chimneys cracked under the heat. Höss ordered massive open pits to be dug, where the bodies were burned in the open air, the smoke visible for miles. This was the man Hans Alexander was now hunting. A man who had looked into the fire and seen only a task to be completed. But as the Allies closed in, the machine began to fail. The orders came from Berlin to destroy the evidence, to blow up the gas chambers, to burn the records, to erase Auschwitz from the face of the earth. Höss watched as his paradise was dismantled, but he didn't stay to die with the Reich. He fled westward, taking with him the identity of Franz Lang and a gold wedding ring that would eventually become his undoing. The transition from the farmyard in Gottrupel to the interrogation cell in Haida was a descent from a fiction into a nightmare of reality. For Rudolf Höss, the man who had spent years presiding over a kingdom of ash, the sudden loss of autonomy was a physical shock. He was no longer the master of the Totenköpfe. He was a prisoner of the very people he had deemed subhuman. Captain Hans Alexander understood this better than anyone. He didn't just want a name, he wanted the soul of the machine. The interrogation was not a single event, but a 22-day siege of the mind. Alexander moved his chair close, the legs scraping against the cold concrete floor, a sound that Höss would later describe as the beginning of the end. There were no bright lights, no elaborate torture devices. There was only the weight of the silence and the presence of a man who knew every lie before it was spoken. Hans Alexander's strategy was built on a foundation of profound psychological insight. He recognized that Höss was a man who lived for recognition. In the Third Reich, Höss had been rewarded for his silence, his efficiency, and his invisibility. To break him, Alexander had to invert that world. He began by treating Höss not as a monster, but as a failed professional. He criticized the clumsiness of the escape. He mocked the Franz Lang identity as amateurish. He attacked the one thing Höss still held dear, his sense of military competence. For a man like Höss, being called a murderer was a badge of duty. Being called a bungler was an insult he could not endure. Alexander watched as the prisoner's jaw tightened, the first crack in the stoic facade. During the long midnight sessions, the air in the cell grew thick with the unsaid. Alexander used a technique of calculated intimacy. He shared his own stories of Berlin, of the life he had lost, forcing Höss to see him as a human being, a German-born man who spoke his own language with a perfect upper-class accent. This created a terrifying cognitive dissonance. According to the Nazi ideology, Alexander was a biological enemy. According to the reality of the room, he was the superior officer, the one in control, the one who held the keys to the future of Höss's wife and children. Alexander leaned into this role of the confessor. He told Höss that the war was over, that the Führer was dead in a ditch, and that the only thing that mattered now was the record. "History will remember you," Alexander whispered. "But will it remember you as a soldier, or as a coward who hid in a woodshed?" The mention of the wedding ring was a constant, sharp needle in the interrogation. It represented the one human tether Höss had left, his devotion to Hedwig. Alexander knew that Höss had compartmentalized his life so thoroughly that he could love his family while slaughtering a million others. By threatening that family, Alexander wasn't just using a blunt instrument, he was attacking the wall that kept Höss sane. He told Höss that the Soviet Union was demanding his extradition. He described the gulags of Siberia. He let Höss imagine his children in the hands of the Red Army. The fear was visible in the way Höss's hands would tremble when he reached for a cup of water. The butcher was being hunted by the ghosts of his own actions. And for the first time in his life, there was no order from Himmler to protect him. Then came the alcohol. In the final week of the Haida interrogation, Alexander introduced high-proof schnapps into the room. He didn't force the prisoner to drink. He offered it as a gesture of officer-to-officer camaraderie. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. As the alcohol loosened the bureaucratic knots in Höss's mind, the professional pride he had suppressed began to leak out. He started to correct Alexander's errors regarding the camp's operations. When Alexander suggested that the gas chambers were a chaotic failure, Höss snapped. He began to describe the brilliance of the ventilation systems he had designed. He bragged about the Operation Höss in Hungary. He spoke of the Zyklon B crystals as if he were a chemist discussing a breakthrough. The accountant was finally balancing the books, and the currency was human lives. Alexander sat in the shadows, his face a mask of iron, as he listened to the man describe the murder of children with the same tone he used to describe a successful harvest. He realized then that he wasn't just breaking a man, he was documenting a new species of evil, the desk-bound murderer. Höss began to write. He filled page after page with a neat, cramped handwriting, detailing the arrival of the transports and the names of the officers who had assisted him. He was no longer Franz Lang. He was Rudolf Höss, the Commandant of Auschwitz, and he wanted the world to know how well he had done his job. The 22 days had stripped away the farmer's skin to reveal the monster beneath, but it was a monster that sought approval from its captor. By the time the British were ready to hand him over to the International Tribunal at Nuremberg, Höss had provided a blueprint of the Holocaust that no one else could offer. He had named the industrial partners, I.G. Farben, Topf and Sons, who had profited from the slaughter. He had detailed the bureaucratic chain of command that led directly to the desks of Hitler's inner circle. Hans Alexander had succeeded where every other interrogator had failed because he understood that the only thing stronger than a Nazi's loyalty to the state was his own vanity. The butcher had been broken not by a fist, but by a mirror held up to his own hollow soul. As Höss was led out of the cell to the transport that would take him to Nuremberg, he looked at Alexander one last time. There was no apology. There was no remorse. There was only a strange, cold recognition between two men who had fought a war in a room no larger than a closet. Alexander watched the truck pull away, the gold wedding ring now sitting in an evidence bag in his pocket. He had found the man, he had broken the silence, and he had ensured that the Franz Langs of the world would never again be able to hide in the silence of the countryside. The world was about to hear the voice of the abyss, and it was a voice that sounded disturbingly like an ordinary man. The journey to Nuremberg was a transition to a different kind of theater. In the Palace of Justice, the atmosphere was clinical, dominated by lawyers in the cold light of international law. But the man who walked into courtroom 600 was the man Hans Alexander had created, a witness who was ready to speak the unthinkable with a level of detail that would shatter the defense of every other Nazi in the dock. The high-ranking officials like Goering and Ribbentrop had spent months claiming they knew nothing of the final solution. They portrayed the camps as work colonies gone wrong due to the pressures of war. Rudolf Höss was about to demolish that lie with a single monotone sentence. April 15th, 1946. Courtroom 600 at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was a room designed for the weight of history, but even its stone walls seemed to lean in when Rudolf Höss was led to the witness stand. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the low, anxious murmur of hundreds of spectators. In the dock sat the giants of the fallen Reich, Goering, Ribbentrop, Kaltenbrunner. For months, they had performed a choreographed dance of denial. They were the grand architects who claimed they never saw the bricks. They were the statesmen who argued that the atrocities were the work of rogue elements and chaotic subordinates. They had built a wall of plausible deniability that the Allied prosecutors were struggling to breach with documents alone. They needed a voice from the center of the storm. They needed the man who had actually turned the valves. When Höss took the stand, he didn't look at the defendants. He sat with his back to them, his posture as rigid as a lightning rod. He was dressed in a plain, ill-fitting suit, looking more like a disgraced clerk than a mass murderer. But when he began to speak, the world stopped breathing. His voice was a flat, emotionless monotone, the same voice Hans Alexander had heard in the dark hours of the Haida interrogation. He didn't wait for the questions to be forced out of him. He delivered the facts of the apocalypse with the dry precision of a quarterly report. The American prosecutor, Colonel Amen, asked the question that the world had been waiting to hear. How many people were exterminated at Auschwitz under your command? The courtroom braced for a denial, for a, "I don't know," or a, "It wasn't me." Instead, Höss corrected the record. He didn't flinch. He told the court that the prosecution's estimate of $3.5 million was slightly inaccurate. He calculated that $2.5 million had been executed in the gas chambers, while another $500,000 had succumbed to disease and starvation. He spoke of 3 million lives as if he were discussing a ledger of coal deliveries. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt physical. In the dock, Hermann Göring's face turned a shade of ash. He stared at the back of Höss's head with a fury that bordered on madness. To Göring, Höss was the ultimate traitor, not because he had killed, but because he was admitting it. He was breaking the omerta of the SS. He was pulling the curtain back on the final solution and showing the world the rusted, blood-stained gears beneath. Höss went on to describe the Hungarian action. He detailed the arrival of 400,000 people in less than 8 weeks. He explained how he had supervised the construction of new rail spurs that led directly to the doors of the crematoria to save time. He described the technical details of Zyklon B, explaining why it was superior to carbon monoxide. He spoke about the children, the thousands of children, who were sent directly to the gas because they were unfit for labor. He told the court that he never questioned these orders. He was a soldier. He was an administrator. He was a man who had been given a problem, the removal of a race, and he had provided the most efficient solution available. The impact of this testimony cannot be overstated. It was the moment the Holocaust became undeniable. It wasn't just a rumor from the East or a horrific film from a liberated camp. It was a confession from the man who had signed the orders. Because of Höss, the defense of the other Nazi leaders collapsed. If the Commandant of Auschwitz was testifying to the industrial scale of the murder, how could the men who funded him and ordered him to do it claim ignorance? He was the witness who chained the entire Nazi leadership to the chimneys of Birkenau. After his testimony, the mood in Nuremberg changed. The legal arguments about waging aggressive war were eclipsed by the sheer moral weight of the genocide Höss had described so casually. But while Nuremberg dealt with the international crime, the Polish people demanded a more direct form of justice. In May 1946, Höss was extradited to Poland. The journey from the refined, legalistic atmosphere of Nuremberg to the ruins of Warsaw was a journey into the heart of the wound. To the Poles, Höss wasn't just a witness, he was the man who had desecrated their soil. He was held in the Rakowieck prison, a place where the guards were often survivors or relatives of those he had murdered. The world expected him to be beaten, to be broken by physical force. But the Polish authorities, led by Judge Jan Sain, were more sophisticated. They realized that a dead Höss was useless. They wanted his mind, they wanted him to write. For months, in the solitude of a Polish prison cell, Rudolf Höss sat with a pen and a stack of paper. He wrote his autobiography, a document that would eventually be published as Commandant of Auschwitz. In these pages, the Franz Lang mask was gone. He wrote about his childhood, his fanatical devotion to the party, and his time at the camp. He described his inner thoughts while watching the gas chambers. He wrote that he had been haunted by the eyes of the children, but that he had suppressed those feelings in the name of duty. It was in these writings that the true banality of evil was laid bare. He didn't write like a demon. He wrote like a man who was deeply sorry, not for the millions he killed, but for the fact that his dedication had led him to a prison cell. The Polish trial, which began in March 1947, was a different kind of theater. The courtroom was filled with survivors wearing their striped camp uniforms. They sat in the front rows, their presence a silent, accusing wall. Höss sat in a glass-enclosed dock, looking smaller and more withered than he had in Nuremberg. He watched as the survivors described things that even he hadn't seen, the specific cruelties of the guards, the black wall executions, the medical experiments. Through it all, he remained a stenographer of his own doom. He occasionally interjected to correct a date or a detail, still obsessed with the accuracy of the record. He seemed to have fully accepted that his life was over, and his only remaining task was to ensure that his achievements at Auschwitz were correctly documented for history. On April 2nd, 1947, the Supreme National Tribunal in Warsaw delivered its verdict. Rudolf Höss was found guilty of crimes against humanity and the murder of millions. He was sentenced to death, but the court decided that he would not die in Warsaw. He would be taken back to Auschwitz. He would be taken back to the place where he had built his paradise. The execution was scheduled for April 16th. In his final letters to his wife, Hedwig, he told her to live an honest life and to never forget the shame he had brought upon their name. It was the first time he had used the word shame. The interrogation that had started in a farmhouse in Gottrupel had finally reached the core of his soul, but it was far too late for the millions who had turned to ash under his watch. April 16th, 1947. The dawn over Auschwitz arrived with a heavy, gray indifference. For Rudolf Höss, this was the final morning of a life defined by the relentless pursuit of order. He was transported from his cell in a closed vehicle, surrounded by a contingent of Polish guards. They didn't speak to him. There was no need for words. The man in the back of the truck was a ghost, a hollowed-out vessel of a regime that had promised 1,000 years and delivered only a mountain of skulls. As the truck rumbled through the main gate of Auschwitz the gate with the infamous Arbeit macht frei slogan, Höss looked out at the barracks he had built, the fences he had electrified, and the gravel paths he had meticulously laid out. He was entering his own creation for the last time. The Polish authorities had made a decision that carried a weight of symbolic justice so profound it bordered on the poetic. They had built the gallows on a small grassy rise between the camp's crematorium and the villa where Höss's family had lived. This was the geography of his soul. To his left, the chimneys where he had evaporated the lives of millions. To his right, the garden where his children had played on a wooden swing. The gallows itself was a simple, stark wooden structure. It was not a grand stage for a public spectacle. There were no crowds, no photographers, no shouting. Only a small group of officials, a few survivors with numbers tattooed into their forearms, and the quiet, biting wind of a Polish spring. Höss stepped down from the truck. He was not handcuffed. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hair combed, his face clean-shaven. He looked like a man going to a board meeting, an image he had maintained until the very end. He walked toward the gallows with a steady military pace. He didn't stumble. He didn't plead. He was a man who had lived his life by the regulations, and he was determined to die by them. As he climbed the wooden steps, he stopped and looked out over the camp. He saw the empty spaces where the transports once arrived. He saw the vast, silent machinery of death that he had perfected. For 22 days in Haida, he had explained the how. In his writings in Warsaw, he had explained the why. Now, in the silence of Auschwitz, he was facing the end. The hangman, a man who had seen the liberation of the camps and had lost his own world to the SS, placed the noose around Höss's neck. The rope was thick and rough. It was the only thing in the world that was real to Höss in that moment. He was offered a final chance to speak. The witnesses leaned in, expecting a final defense, a final Heil Hitler, or perhaps a genuine plea for forgiveness. But Höss, the man who had turned the industrialization of murder into a monotone routine, simply nodded. He remained silent. At 10:08 a.m., the trapdoor was released. The drop was short. The end was swift. The architect of Auschwitz was gone, but the abyss he had opened remained wide, a scar on the face of humanity that would never truly heal. The body of Rudolf Höss was not given back to his family. The Polish government, fearing that his grave would become a site of pilgrimage for those who still harbored the Nazi virus, ordered his remains to be cremated. His ashes were scattered, lost to the wind, ensuring that the man who had turned millions into smoke would end as nothing more than smoke himself. He left behind a wife who would live in the shadows of her paradise, and 5 children who would spend their lives grappling with a name that had become a synonym for the unthinkable. But more importantly, he left behind the transcripts. The words extracted by Hans Alexander and Judge Jan Zen were the real legacy of those 22 days. Because Rudolf Höss had broken, the world was given the golden key to the Holocaust. His detailed clinical descriptions of the gas chambers and the crematoria made it impossible for the industrial giants of Germany to claim they were just supplying a client. Companies like IG Farben and Topf & Sons were stripped of their excuses. The bureaucratic chain of command was exposed, linking the highest offices in Berlin to the lowest guards on the ramp. Because one man's ego was larger than his loyalty, the Omerta of the SS was shattered. Hundreds of other war criminals were caught because Höss had named them. The Franz Langs, who thought they could hide in farmhouses, found that the Commandant had already sold them out to history. Captain Hans Alexander, the Jewish refugee who had returned as a hunter, lived to see the fruits of his labor. He didn't gloat over the execution. For Alexander, the victory wasn't the rope, it was the truth. He had taken the most dangerous secret in the world and forced it into the light. He had proven that even the most disciplined, cold-hearted bureaucrat has a breaking point, and that justice, when pursued with a knife and a mirror, can find its way into the most fortified mind. Alexander died in 2004, a hero who rarely spoke of his mission, a man who understood that the real battle against the unethical isn't fought on a battlefield, but in the quiet, brutal interrogation of a human soul. The story of Rudolf Höss is the ultimate warning for our age. It reminds us that the greatest atrocities are not always the work of madmen, but of ordinary men who view the world through a lens of efficiency rather than empathy. It tells us that when a man can tuck his children into bed while calculating the gas consumption of a crematorium, the world has lost its way. The gallows at Auschwitz still stand today, a lonely, wooden sentinel in a field of ghosts. They stand as a reminder that the butcher was found, the silence was broken, and the abyss was documented. But they also stand as a question. If the world encountered such a man again, would we have the clarity of Hans Alexander to see through the mask of the farmer? This has been the chronicle of the man who perfected the end of the world. A man who was broken by a wedding ring and a Jewish officer's knife. A man whose name is now written in the ash of the millions he murdered. The chimneys of Auschwitz have been cold for 80 years, but the lessons of the Rudolf Höss interrogation will echo as long as we have the courage to remember them. For the Unethical channel, this is the final account of the man who looked into the fire and didn't look away until it was too late. The death of Rudolf Höss at the end of a Polish rope was the final chapter for the man, but for the name he carried, the nightmare was only beginning. While the ashes of the butcher were scattered into the soil of Auschwitz to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine, the living legacy of his crimes remained a radioactive burden for his family. Hedwig Höss, the woman who had presided over her paradise villa with the cold indifference of a queen, was cast out into the ruins of a Germany that no longer wanted her. She lived the rest of her days in the gray periphery of society, moving to the United States for a time, living under assumed names, and dying in 1989 in Arlington, Virginia. She took her secrets to the grave, never publicly repenting for the luxury she enjoyed while millions burned just over her garden wall. The 5 children of Rudolf Höss, Klaus, Haida Traut, Ingebrigit, Hans-Jürgen, and Annegret, grew up in the shadow of a ghost. They were the children who had played on the swings while the smell of the crematoria drifted through their hair. For them, the interrogation that broke their father didn't just provide the world with the truth. It robbed them of the lie they had been told about their heroic father. Some of them chose a life of total silence, disappearing into the suburban landscapes of America and Germany, terrified that their neighbors would discover the bloodline they carried. Others, like his daughter Brigitte, became a fashion model in Spain and later worked for a Jewish-owned boutique in Washington, D.C., keeping her identity hidden for decades, a silent witness to the irony of her own survival. But the most visceral break in the Höss legacy occurred decades later, through the eyes of his grandson, Rainer Höss. Rainer did what his own father and aunts could not. He looked directly into the abyss. He visited Auschwitz. He stood on the gallows where his grandfather was executed. He met with survivors and looked into the eyes of those who had seen his grandfather's boots on the ramp. Rainer's choice to publicly denounce Rudolf Höss is the final act of the interrogation that Hans Alexander started in 1946. It is the proof that while evil can be systemic and hereditary, the truth is a decontaminant. By refusing to carry the honor of the Höss name, Rainer completed the dismantling of the butcher's ego, proving that even the most meticulously built paradise of the Third Reich would eventually be reclaimed by the moral conscience of history. The story of the interrogation that broke the butcher serves as a definitive case study in the anatomy of accountability. It shows us that justice is not merely a matter of punishment, but of documentation. Had Höss not been caught, had he died as Franz Lang in a quiet farmhouse, the history of the Holocaust would be missing its most clinical, undeniable map. We would be left with the fragmented memories of the survivors, which the deniers would try to dismiss as exaggeration. Instead, we have the words of the architect himself. We have the logistics, the numbers, and the cold, hard mechanics of the end of the world. Because one Jewish officer refused to let a farmhand keep his secrets, the world was given a mirror that we must never stop looking into. This brings us to the ultimate question for the viewers of Unethical. We look at Rudolf Höss, and we see a monster, but the interrogations reveal something far more terrifying. A man who loved horses, who was loyal to his wife, and who believed he was doing a difficult job for a cause he thought was righteous. The unethical truth of our history is that the most catastrophic evils are often perpetrated by the most disciplined people. It is the bureaucrat, the specialist, and the good soldier who are capable of the greatest depravity when they stop asking, "Is this right?" and only ask, "Is this efficient?" As we close this investigation into the life, the capture, and the final moments of Rudolf Höss, we are left with the silence of the Auschwitz Museum. The barracks are empty, the gallows are still, and the grass grows over the pits. But the transcripts of those 22 days in 1946 remain as a warning to every generation. They tell us that the mask of the ordinary can hide the heart of the abyss, and that our only defense against the return of the butchers is a relentless, uncompromising commitment to the truth, no matter how much it hurts to hear. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Unethical. The story of Rudolf Höss is a heavy one, but it is one that must be told if we are to truly understand the price of justice and the depth of human darkness. If you found this documentary insightful, please like the video and share it with those who value historical truth. What do you think was the most shocking part of the Höss interrogation? Was it the moment of the ring or his clinical detachment at Nuremberg? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Unethical and hit the notification bell. We have many more stories to uncover, stories of the hunters, the hunted, and the moments where the shadow of history was finally brought into the light. Until next time, remember, The past is never truly buried as long as the truth remains to be told.